This video will describe how to replace either the axle shaft, the dust plates, or the rear axle seals on a Dodge Ram with the full floating axles that look like that. This particular truck is a 2003 Dodge Ram 2500 or 3/4 ton. So let me show you what some of those parts look like, why we might be doing this job. So I got the other side apart to make it a little easier to describe what I'm doing, but you can see the original dust shield here is quite rusty. My truck in general is in pretty good shape because I undercoated it regularly and painted things, but some areas are just very difficult in a salty environment to keep from rusting. But you can see this is a pretty awesome piece here. You can just buy the dust shields, which are cheaper, but depending upon how much you value your time, which I like to spend a little less time on some things. This will actually come as a full kit. Dorman provides this one, but it's put all together, so you get everything, which is kind of nice. So if you buy just the dust shields, then you don't have that, which this is in decent shape, but taking that all apart can take time. And then in addition to saving a little bit of time, sometimes you get all this apart just to realize one of the pieces you have isn't quite right or needs to be replaced. So it really can be a time saver, even though these are about $100-ish per side. And the dust shields, I think, are only like 30 some dollars. The other reason you might do this is to replace the rear axle seals, which these ones are actually fine, but by the time you're in there to do the job, the rear axle seal is a pretty easy thing to do. They cost about $20-ish, and it's nice to have the old one out before you order the new ones. Otherwise you might have a problem like this, where this is the first one I ordered, which when I went to match it up, you can see they are not the same. They are actually really similar diameter, but they're not the same seal, so you might be inclined to try that, but it isn't the same. So just make sure you get the dimensions and take a look at it, match up what you have, so that way you don't end up getting into your job just to realize you need to order another part like I did. All right, so back over to the truck here. So here's a few of the tools that are nice. Probably an extra step, but I like to clean things up before I start taking it apart. So I used a wire wheel, of course using eye protection when you do that, to kind of clean things up. Because these bolts, if you like to paint things like I do, these bolts could have paint on them, and then it takes a little more time to get the socket off. So I just clean things up, but also it keeps stuff from getting inside of the hub assembly. So I went over there with the wire wheel and then kind of cleaned things up. And then some other tools that might be nice. For the bolts that are on the back side, these are 24 millimeter. A wrench works just fine. There's a couple of them you can use or impact with an extension, especially if you got a universal joint, can make it easier, or big ratchet like that. And then the rubber mallet is invaluable in some of these jobs. But anyways, let's show what we got here. So I chose to use an impact to do this. You can use a wrench or a ratchet with a socket. The only difference is with the impact, it's not going to rotate this as much. If you're going to use one of those, you got to probably put something in like this to hold that in place while you loosen them. And just be careful not to ruin the threads on your studs as you do that. But the impact's real nice because it you can basically hold this in place with your hand while you do it. So I've taken the other ones out except for one, and we're going to remove this last one. Once I'm getting close to coming out, I'll take the socket off the bolt one last time. Just makes it a little easier to get the bolt out of the socket once it's all. Now you notice it starts to drip here. That's normal because this is there's basically the oil is continuous with all this, lubricates the bearings and everything. So see, that comes out a little bit easier then as I clean them off and everything. Now at this point, the axle will pull straight out. Try to kind of support it, especially if you're going to try to save your seals. When the spline comes out, you'll want to try not to damage the seals as that spline comes out. So just go slow and gentle, try to support the weight, keep it coming out evenly. You can see that's what we have there. Now, it's good to have a clean surface to set these on. So, I'll show you where we're at here. So this is the axle shaft from the other side. I've already cleaned it off, but I put down some clean plastic so that way it's not going to get a bunch of debris on it. I mean, you still probably will clean it off before you put it back in, but the less garbage you have on that, the better. Here's the one we just took out. You can see what we're left with here. So what we have is a retaining clip here, a little keyway that keeps this nut, or whatever you want to call it, in place, and then we can rotate that out. Okay, I'll show you what that looks like removing that. So probably a couple different ways to do this, but you can see a needle nose pliers like this gets in there pretty well, and then you can just work that all the way around. Do it carefully so you don't bend it. You can see that comes out just like that. Now, have an area you can keep your stuff to keep it nice and clean and organized, or fairly clean and organized. Then this can pull that key out just like that. See that? That just keeps that nut from rotating when it's all put together. Now, I've seen some people who say count the number of times this nut comes off as you pull it out to know how much tension you have on there. That's one way to do it, but I actually prefer to tighten it the way it's supposed to be, just enough so that way you don't have free play. You can see as I pull on that, there's very minimal free play. There's a tiny bit because this truck has over 100,000 miles on it, but there's not a lot, and that's kind of the idea of how tight to put this, and we'll go through what the recommendation is on how to do that. But there is a special nut that you can get that will take this off, but it's not torqued. Right? It's not torqued because this needs to rotate freely. So that nut is pretty easy to get off, and all you need is something like this, where you can just get in there and then rotate that. See, I honestly probably didn't need that. You can use your hands again because it's not torqued. So after we remove that completely, I'll show you where we're at. So then you're left with the retaining clip, the key, and then that comes totally off. All right. After that happens, then you have your hub assembly here. That whole hub assembly will just pull straight off, just directly back. It might take a little bit of persuasion. You can feel free to use a rubber mallet, especially if you're going to try to reuse your seals, though. Be cautious. Okay, and then I'll show you the opposite side here. So that rear axle seal starts off there. So now at this point we're ready to pull the hub off. I did pull the bearing out first, which it will come out with the hub, which is fine, but if you do take it out, I used a little bit of paper towel to help protect that race, just in case you get into that, because you don't want to nick that race pulling that hub off. Okay. I didn't mention earlier, but the bolts that hold the axle shaft in place here, these are 14 millimeter. All right, so I'll show you what that looks like here. Okay, so this can take a little bit of persuasion to get it off. I try to pull, wiggle. You can use a rubber mallet to kind of tap on here, and then it should pull straight off like that. You want to be careful so you don't wreck your bearing. In this case, I can see my seal will already need to be replaced on this side. The other side actually looked okay. In this case, the seal has actually separated into two pieces. Okay. Now, normally I would recommend just taking apart one side and then the other. In this case, I did both just to make it easier to show what I'm doing. So otherwise I would say do one side and then the other. In this case, I am doing both. So I labeled the hub on this side because you want the bearing, if you're not replacing your bearings, you want the bearing that went with that race to go back on it. So I labeled things that way. Now, the bolts that, if you're going to do the dust plate or this whole assembly like I am, the bolts that, the nuts on the back side of this that hold that in place are 24 millimeter. You can do them all with a wrench. You can do some of them with a ratchet. The top ones, though, you can only back out part way. Otherwise, you'll get your ratchet stuck between there and the U-bolt. So you back them out just part way. Okay, so I've tapped on that brake caliper bracket mount a few times with. Actually, at first I started with the rubber mallet, but this regular hammer worked better. Hit it just a few times until it's loosened up, and then this whole assembly will come off. Now, when you're pulling it off, make sure you don't scratch the shaft there. Then you can just kind of set that down until later when you get that parking brake cable off. Now, one thing that I ran into on this side that didn't occur on the other side is the seal actually came apart. Normally the whole seal will come off and you can even reuse it. In this case, that's not going to happen. This part came off here. So what I ended up doing is just using a screwdriver like that, kind of prying until it loosens up in all four areas, and then it'll come off like that. And then what I'll do is I'll clean up that surface because there is a little rust, which is why this didn't come off in one piece. So now you can see that's pretty much the whole disassembly process. So at this point, I'll be taking out the old seal and putting in a new one. I'll show you how to do that. There's a few different ways to do that, but using a screwdriver that you can pound on the end, or this is better because it's metal all the way through. You won't wreck your screwdriver. Put that right in the lip here, and then just gentle tapping with a hammer. You can see I did one or two little hits there, and you can see it's already starting to separate. See there, it's not separated. And then you just work it all the way around. All the way around, and then that whole thing will come out. And then, like, you know, get it all cleaned up. Make sure you don't have, if you're using wire brush or wire wheel or whatever, clean it up. Make sure you don't get any of those on the inside. And, you know, I use a little bit of paper towel just to kind of close that off in there when I am cleaning the outside. But even when they're done, spray it out with a brake cleaner or something to just make extra sure, because if you get a little wire in there, or dirt or metal, that's all going to reduce the life of your bearings and everything. So after you're all done, then your assembled hub will look like this. I took that inner bearing out, packed it with grease. It is lubricated by the axle oil, you know, the differential oil, because it's a full floating system. The oil comes all the way to the end, as you could see as it leaked out, but packing it with grease will, I think, be a good option. And then you can see the seal there. I even did some lubrication on the seal. Also cleaned up the receiving area there, put a coat of paint on there just to make it look extra nice. Now, earlier I mentioned removal of the parking brake cable. There's a few ways to do that. The best way to do that, I believe, would be to use the adjuster to give yourself some slack on the cable. My adjuster is pretty old, and I did not want to take a chance of breaking that, so I did something that's probably a little different and maybe not the best, but it worked for me. I used some wire to kind of take some slack off that spring, and then you can use a little more wire to just hold the parking brake slightly closer, which means the pads are coming out a bit, and then a screwdriver in here to pull that spring down, and then you can get that in place. So you can see just a little, again, I don't think that's the best way to do it, but that's how I did it because I didn't want to take any chance of breaking my adjuster. All right, so I got the hub put together. The seal looks like that for this model, and I'm just gonna put it right in the bore there. Use a rubber mallet to sort of gently work it in. When you pound, make sure you're pounding on the metal part and not on the rubber part, and it should be completely flush all the way around. There are some versions of this seal that don't have this outer lip that I saw when I was purchasing this. I don't even know if those ones are right, but the outer lip is nice because then you can't pound it in too far. And then we got the new dust panel, or dust protector, whatever you want to call it, and brake caliper mounting bracket mounted. The bolts on the back side are there. I should say studs with the nuts. I did use thread locker on there. I used medium strength. I don't know that you absolutely have to, but I think that's a good policy. On the hub bolts, it really should. The manufacturer definitely recommends that. And those are 145 foot-pounds there. If you don't have a torque wrench, tighten them tight. You can see that looks significantly better than what it is replacing. All right, here we're finishing up the installation. I got the hub on there, and wanted to show this part here. So the nut is on there, and there's a procedure to making sure it's correctly tightened. So if it's too tight, there will be resistance with rotation of the hub. If it's too loose, you'll have free play there. What the manual indicates is to use this specialized socket that fits over this, tighten that to 22 foot-pounds, and then back it off a quarter turn, and then get it to the closest area where the key will fit in the keyway to keep that from rotating. So if you don't have that special socket, you can actually borrow one from the auto store, but you almost don't necessarily need to do that either. So before I started, I did actually take a picture of this just to see how far in it was, so I would have an idea, just to make sure, kind of to double check that it was in there the correct way. And I just counted the threads, and there were 3 of them, so I have an idea that I'm in the right area. And I used a needle nose like this to rotate it, and as you're doing it, kind of spin the hub assembly and tighten, and you'll tighten until it basically won't tighten anymore, okay? And then you're gonna, at that point, then back off a quarter turn, and then just a little bit more until that keyway is in the right spot, okay? The next step after that will be placement of the gasket on here. So the original gasket kind of looks like that. It, tore. I wouldn't reuse that. You could really just use some RTV, like silicone oil resistant sealant on there. That would be reasonable. I know that does work, but I ordered the seals. I just ordered the gaskets at the same time. Then you still want to use a little bit of sealant on there because you don't want that to leak. The next step will be placement of these bolts on the outside. Now you can see there's actually some thread locker on the original. The original equipment recommendation is to replace these bolts, but I don't necessarily think that is totally necessary. So just clean them up, make sure they're good, and then put some thread locker on there. Then those will get torqued. Those are 14 millimeter, and those get torqued to 95 foot-pounds. Okay. And then you're all done. Just replace a little bit of the rear end fluid that leaked out. Make sure that is all good. Just in case it wasn't totally clear, I'm gonna actually show the details of this part. So I've been tightening this. It's just about where I would expect it to be, and see, it's rotating, and tight there. Okay, so now I'm going to mark about a quarter of a turn from there. Should be here. So when that mark is up top, then that will be a quarter turn back. You can see if I just left it like this tight, it does rotate, but there's some resistance to that. So what we want to do is take away that resistance. Now that would be a quarter turn back. You notice that the keyway, there's one here and one here. Okay, so This isn't obviously exact, but if I'm rotating really freely here and I come to this keyway, which is just a little bit tighter, see if I'm still free, and I am. So I'm going to stick with that one. Otherwise, if I go to this one, just be a little looser, which is still fine, right? But I'll just go to this one since, again, a quarter turn would be there to there, but I need that keyway available to lock it. All right, and then just to know you did the right thing, should rotate nice and freely, but there should be no lateral movement, no free play. Okay? I can tug on that and I got nothing, but it feels very good that way. So then I can slide in my key, and that'll keep that nut from turning. And then I'll go ahead and put my lock ring in place there. And then, as discussed before, then I'll go ahead and put the axle shaft in with the new gasket and gasket sealer. All right. Any questions? Let me know. That's my process for doing this. Although, as mentioned, there are some variations on it.